So the book of 2 Kings, we're getting closer and closer to the end, and today we should finish up chapter 21. We'll kind of see how things are going. We might be able to get into chapter 22 a little bit, but we'll see once we get there. And so far in chapter 21, which it's been 2 weeks now because of the gospel meeting last week, but 2 weeks ago we were able to finish looking at Manasseh's reign. And then today we're going to get into Ammon's reign. But if y'all would, let's just kind of look together and sort of bring ourselves back to where we are. Of course, looking through in the reign of Manasseh, you can look there in really the first 9 verses of chapter 21 where you get some of that overview. And you see how it is that Manasseh was a very, very, very wicked king. One of the things that's brought out in those first 9 verses is how Manasseh led the people of Judah astray, and he led them astray to do more wicked, more abominations than the nations whom God had cast out before them. And so God's own people were truly unrecognizable. God's own people were not living as they should, worshiping as they should, treating others as they should. Everything that they did at this point was truly wicked, and as the Bible describes it, an abomination. And then in verses 10 through 16, we see where it is that the Lord would send his servants to Manasseh and to the people and tell them what was going to happen. You get down into verse 13 of chapter 21, and you see how God says, I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria and the plummet of the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. God was going to clean house. That's what he's saying here. He's done the survey, he's gone through, he's examined everything, and it's not measuring up to where it needs to be. Jerusalem is going to fall. Judah is going to fall. They're going to be cleaned out as they need to be. And then he goes on and talks about how in verse 14, I will forsake the remnant. But why is it that God is going to forsake the remnant? Because they had done what to him? They had forsaken him. They had already turned from God, and they were showing that there was no desire to come back. And then verse 16, that mention of Manasseh shedding very much innocent blood. And as we talked about, some of that, of course, would probably connect back to the child sacrifice that was going on at the time. But also in some of the history that was recorded, as Josephus writes, he talks about how Manasseh had one of the righteous men, one of the prophets, killed every single day in the streets of Jerusalem. And so all of that adds into the righteous blood, the innocent blood that was shed by Manasseh. And then you read about the end of his life in verses 17 and 18. But one of the things that we looked at that the Kings does not record but is mentioned in the Chronicles is how it is at the end of Manasseh's life. He was actually taken captive, led astray, or led captive to Assyria. And while he was in Assyria, the Bible tells us that Manasseh humbled himself and he prayed to God, and God heard and answered the prayer and delivered him out of that captivity and brought him back to Jerusalem. And when he came back to Jerusalem, do you remember what it is that Manasseh did?
He restored worship back to God.
He did what he could to restore true worship back. When Manasseh came back to Jerusalem, he took all the idols out of the temple, and he made a command throughout the land that all the people should worship the Lord God and him alone. And then what we find is the people did that up to a point. The people didn't all come back to Jerusalem. Instead, the people end up worshiping God at all of the high places. But at the end of Manasseh's life, he tries to fix things. He tries to turn things around. And I wanted to bring that up because of something we'll discuss here in just a moment whenever we start looking at Ammon's reign. So let's look here at Ammon's reign, 2 Kings 21. Let's have somebody read verses 19 through 22.
Ammon was 22 years old when he became the king, and he reigned for 2 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Meshullemeth, the daughter of Haris the Jothbah. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and his father Manasseh, as his father Manasseh had done. So he walked in the ways that his father had walked, and served the idols that his father had served, and worshipped them. He forsook the Lord God of his fathers, and did not walk in the way of the Lord.
So we look at Ammon, and we see that when he became king, according to verse 19, he was 22 years old, and his reign was a very short reign by comparison to many of the others. He reigned only for 2 years, so he would die at 24. But about Ammon, we see as well in this section that his mother was Meshulamith, and that is the fact that she was the daughter of Haruz of Jotbah. That's really all that we know of her. There's not anything else about her that comes up. But whenever we look at Jotbah, there are two possible places that could be. Here, one possibility is that her family was from way up north. So you've got Jerusalem right there, Jotbah way up there is a possibility. If that's the case, then it would mean probably that her family were refugees from the north whenever Assyria came in, that maybe they fled down south. Another possibility is that she could be from way down south. And if that's the case, basically Jerusalem up here, the other possible location way down here, then that would mean that, of course, her family was not from the land of Israel, that they were not of the children of God. And, of course, we understand the challenges and difficulties that come from that. Of course, you look throughout the Old Testament, and the command was always that God's people marry among God's people. And we know, at least when it comes to Ammon, that he didn't really care about that. And for the most part, in his father's life before him, his father overall didn't care about that either until the very end. But looking at the way that Ammon lived his life, the way that he reigned, how does the Bible describe it in verse 20? He did what? He did evil. So Ammon was another evil king. And his evil was like whose evil? Like his father Manasseh. All you have to do is go back to the start of this chapter to see just how evil Manasseh was. See how it is that Manasseh was introducing idols of all sorts, that Manasseh was bringing in worship to whatever idol you can think of, and then if you looked at the sky and you saw any star in the sky, there was going to be worship to all of those stars as well. And so that's who Manasseh was looking to. And then, of course, you have the child sacrifice involved and all sorts of other things that were happening in this time. Ammon was following in that particular example. Even though Manasseh had come in and removed the idols, according to 2 Chronicles 33, verses 15 and 16, the Bible tells us right here in 2 Kings 21, what did Ammon do? He, according to verse 21, served what? He served the idols his father had served, and he worshiped them. So if Manasseh had taken those idols and removed them, then what does that tell us that Ammon did? Ammon went and got them and brought them back. He returned them back so that he could continue to worship and to serve these particular idols. And the difference here between Ammon and Manasseh is, of course, at the end of Manasseh's life, what did Manasseh do? He humbled himself and he repented. But let's turn to 2 Chronicles 33. 2 Chronicles 33, it tells us something else about Ammon as it relates to the connection between he and his father Manasseh. 2 Chronicles 33, and we'll have somebody read verse 23.
And he did not humble himself before the Lord, as his father Manasseh had humbled himself, but Ammon trespassed more and more.
So while Manasseh humbles himself and makes things right with God, Ammon does not. But I think within this, there's maybe something that we can think about and something that we can learn and consider. Manasseh, at the end of his life, tries to do what he can to correct and to undo the mistakes from earlier in his life and earlier in his reign. But now you come to Ammon, and what do we see in that?
He refuses.
Ammon refuses to change, and despite all of his father's attempts, it was already too late for Ammon, wasn't it? Do you think there's anything that we can learn from that? You have something on this, Johnny?
That's why God commands us to train up a child in the way he should walk.
Mm-hmm.
When he is old, he will not depart from it.
Right. Yeah, and it starts
And that's
early.
Too little, too late.
Exactly.
To change his son.
Right, that it's important to start early and train them up early, because the longer you wait, the more difficult it's going to be. That's not to say that it would be an impossibility, but you think about for Ammon. Ammon sees how it is that his father lived and his father reigned for basically all of his upbringing. I mean, he was only 22 whenever he becomes king. Not sure exactly how long some of the corrections had been there. Maybe Ammon was 16, 17, 18, 19 whenever his father comes back from captivity and is going to try and turn things around now. But whatever the case is, it was too late for Ammon. Ammon, of course, still had his own decisions and his own choices to make. But do you realize where we're going with this? The decisions that we as parents, or we as grandparents, or we as aunts and uncles, or whoever we are, the decisions that we make now impact those around us, and especially those who are younger and those who are in our care, those who are looking up to us. The actions that we take right now may just impact whether or not our children or our grandchildren or our nieces or nephews or whoever the children may be. It may determine whether or not they someday decide to obey the gospel or not. It may determine what it is that they do when they find themselves caught up in sin at some point. Are they going to see the way that we respond to sin in our own life? Do we try to hide it and kind of keep it concealed from everybody else? Or are we humble enough to recognize when we mess up? Do our children or our grandchildren, nieces, nephews, again, whoever the child may be, do they see the way that we respond to difficulties in life? Do they see the way that we handle interactions with others in life? All of these things are going to play into the way that they're going to choose to live and the decisions that they're going to make as they get older, especially as it relates to their spiritual life. Now, it may be the case that we have not lived our life and made the decisions that we should whenever it is that those children are younger and we have more of an impact and influence on them. I want to emphasize again, it doesn't mean just because Ammon didn't turn and make things right, it doesn't mean that it's ever too late. But it's going to be more difficult. And we have to recognize that. If the children are young, we have a much greater opportunity. And you know what? It may be something that there were mistakes that were made with our own children, but what about opportunities that may come from grandchildren? One of the things that Adam mentioned in the gospel meeting was about the opportunity that grandparents have that parents don't always have. The way that children are probably going to listen to grandparents before they listen to their own parents. Do what we can to make sure we have the right impact and the right influence. Influence for good and not for bad. And so that's something I think that's important to bring up as we look at this between Manasseh and Ammon. That Ammon followed Manasseh in all of the wicked, but wasn't willing to do the hard thing and to humble himself in turn. And of course, we'll see some of these things come up again once we get to Josiah in chapter 23, or chapter 22 and 23, of the change that's going to happen there, just as a reminder that we all make our own decisions and choices, no matter how young, no matter how old we may be. But we need to do what we can with the influence that we have to influence for good and not for evil. Anything else on that before we move on? So let's get then to verses 23 and 24. Verses 23 and 24, we're going to see this conspiracy that comes up. And let's have somebody read these two verses for us.
Then the servants of Ammon conspired against him and killed the king in his own house. But the people of the land executed all those who had conspired against King Ammon. Then the people of the land made his son Josiah king in his palace.
So we don't know what exactly this, what all the conspiracy entailed. We don't know why these particular people decided to do what they did. But what decision do they make to do? We're going to kill the king, right? We're going to assassinate him. So they set out, they kill the king, and then what happens to the ones who killed the king? They're captured and they're executed, right? Justice takes place here, and then who becomes king? Josiah. So Ammon's son Josiah became king in his place. A lot of things, a lot of speculation could be said as to why it is that these people decided to conspire against Ammon, but at the end of the day, we know that he was killed and that his son Josiah becomes king, and then the history is going to move on from there. But let's finish up with Ammon. If someone will read verses 25 and 26 now.
Now the rest of the acts of Ammon, which he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And he was buried in his tomb in the garden of Uzzah. And then Josiah his son reigned in his place.
We've got the typical formula here, the typical conclusion at the end of one of these kings' lives. There's the mention that there's more that they did, the rest of their acts and the history that they could go back to and see. But we've got the history that we need right here that tells us that Ammon was not a good king. Ammon was a wicked king who just followed in the way of Manasseh and forsook God and abandoned him even to a greater degree. So Ammon was killed, Ammon is buried. Now we have Josiah reigning in his place. And before we start looking at Josiah, we'll talk about our takeaways from chapter 21. So the first takeaway we have is that wicked leaders lead to wicked people. This is going to go all the way back to the first class that we had in chapter 21 when we started looking at Manasseh. And you look at chapter 21, and I believe it's specifically in verse 9. 2 Kings 21 and verse 9. What is it that Manasseh did? He seduced the people to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. Wicked leaders lead the wicked people. All the application that came from that first particular class, so much of it really keyed in on the importance of having the right leaders in place. The importance within the church of making sure that we have qualified elders serving, qualified deacons serving, that we have those who are in leadership positions, if you will, that they are going to lead the people in the right way and not in the wrong way. Because as the leaders go, so go the people. I think Johnny Yude brought up the verse from the New Testament that Jesus talks about. If the blind lead the blind, they'll both fall into a ditch. Well, it only stands to reason that if a wicked leader leads for so long, what's going to come of the people? They're going to be wicked as well. So that's one of the takeaways. The next is the fact that the Lord is going to execute justice. The Lord is going to do what is right. Thinking about what it is that happens in the middle of the chapter once the Lord sends the prophets to Manasseh and to the people, and there's the mention of how it is that because the people have forsaken God, because of their wickedness and all of their abominations, God's going to clean house. He's going to wipe them clean like a dish. He's going to turn it over and let it dry out. They're going to be taken into captivity because they had forsaken Him time and time and time and time and time again. God's not going to overlook it. God's going to bring about justice. And then the last lesson that we can take, big lesson from chapter 21, some mistakes cannot be undone. And this goes right where we were talking about a moment ago between Manasseh and Ammon. Manasseh tries to fix things at the end of his life, and he does a pretty good job, but when it came to his own home, some mistakes were too much to be changed. And we have to recognize that in our lives, and especially those of us who are younger in the home, those of us who are younger parents, those who may not have children yet, to make sure that we recognize that what we do right now can impact for generations to come. And we have to make sure that we're making the right decisions, making the right choices, acting as God would have us to act so that we do not have these big mistakes as Manasseh did that are going to be a challenge to overcome in our life and in our family. And so that gets us through chapter 21, and now we come to chapter 22. And I don't know whose watch it was that made that noise, but that was like perfect timing. It was like, all right, we're done with 21, now 22. Chapter 22, I've called this A Treasure is Found. And as we get into the chapter, it'll become clear what the particular treasure is. Of course, you can kind of look probably at your headings. If your Bible, if your translation has some of the section headings, you can probably already see what's going to be discovered here in the chapter, and it truly is a treasure. So at the end of 21, we see that Ammon is killed, and the people take Josiah and make him king in Ammon's place. Let's look at the first 2 verses of chapter 22, where we'll see Josiah's reign. If someone could just go ahead and read both of those verses.
Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidah, the daughter of Adaiah of Bozkath, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in all the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left.
Josiah was 8 years old. I don't think right now we have any 8-year-olds. How old is Lincoln? 9. So picture Lincoln a year ago. There's Josiah, suddenly made king. His father was just killed. You can imagine the turmoil this is going to bring. Now, we talked about it some when we first got to Manasseh. Manasseh was young himself. There would have been certain counselors and advisors who were going to try and lead things and steer things in a particular way. But it certainly does not say very much about the strength of the nation if an 8-year-old is the face of the nation, does it? This is the situation that the people of God find themselves in. But as it relates to Josiah, his name means Yah, as in Yahweh. Yah supports. Don't you think Josiah is going to need the support of God himself if he's going to do what he needs to do? And we see what it is that he's going to do by the time we get into verse 2. Because what does the Bible tell us about Josiah's reign and his character according to verse 2 of chapter 22?
He does it the right way.
Josiah does it the right way. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord. What had Josiah's father done for all 8 years of Josiah's life? Evil. Beyond that, you go back to Manasseh, because Josiah would have been alive when Manasseh was also alive. Josiah would have seen a little bit of the end, perhaps, of Manasseh's life. How much of it he understood, who knows? But the bulk of anything Josiah would have heard about his granddaddy Manasseh was what? All the evil that he had done. So Josiah is going to have to do things differently. Josiah is going to have to switch things up here, and he's going to be different from his father and his grandfather before him. Did I see your hand, Mom?
Well, I was just wondering, on both of those, Amon and Josiah, it tells us who their mother was and where they're from, and it's followed by Amon was very evil, and Josiah was good. I just wondered if their mother was the influence.
Very possibly. Because I showed the map a second ago on Ammon's mother, the possibility that maybe she was from way up north, could have been refugee from Assyria. Her family may have been. And of course, you think about Samaria and Israel to the north, they weren't who they needed to be, which is why there would have to be refugees from there. And even if she was from way down south, then her family were not of the people of God. Here for Josiah, when it talks about his mother, Jedidah, the daughter of Adaiah of Bozkath. Don't really know exactly where Bozkath was, but in Joshua chapter 15 and verse 39, it mentions that city between Lachish and Eglon, which would have been just not too far removed from Jerusalem. So, to your point, it's very possible, because here you have one who is actually from the area, from Judah, among the people of God, that maybe there you have good influence from her because of her upbringing. Very, very possible. And so it's always, and I mentioned it before, how I find it interesting that you have mention of who these individuals' mothers were, and you just have a very brief detail of who their parents were and things like that. And some of that, of course, is because of the importance of the genealogical records for them, for the children of God, especially once they would come out of captivity. But even still, just to have that little mention, I always wonder, well, what more, what more could be added if we knew more about them? But maybe something about the region that they're from, and some of that could certainly play into it. So that's a good thought on that. And so Josiah, again, 8 years old, we see who his mother was. We see the fact then that he's going to be a good and a righteous king. He's going to be the king that they need to have. Mentions in verse 2 how Josiah walked in all the ways of his father David, and he did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 17, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, there's like a list there of certain requirements and laws for when the people of Israel had a king. And that's always something that I find pretty fascinating to think about, is the fact that in Deuteronomy 17, long before the children of God actually asked for a king, God already knew what they were going to do, and God went ahead and had this in place in the law, that when they asked for a king, even though they shouldn't have, even though that was still way down the road, there's very clear requirements of what the king was to do and was not to do. But Deuteronomy 17 and verse 20, it talks about for the king, that the king was not to turn to the right or to the left. The king was to stay just down the middle, if you will. And that's exactly what we have with Josiah. Now, in Josiah, in his reign, just for some other connection of some different biblical things, some of the prophets we find would begin their ministry in the reign of Josiah. Zephaniah, if you look at Zephaniah chapter 1 and verse 1, Zephaniah began his prophetic ministry during the reign of Josiah, but also the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah's reign would begin if you look at Jeremiah 1 verses 1 through 3. And so some of that history can start to play in, and of course we'll see how all of it continues as we go. But I saw Geraldine and then Johnny.
I just had a quick question about, this is a little off topic, it's just about his mother. Just out of curiosity, just for history's sake, why is it never mentioned, like the queen? Like the wives are usually never referred to as the queen. Was that not really the way they did things?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for you. I mean, based on what we see so often, I mean, it was always the king and the man. But also when it would come to the queen, think back to Solomon. I mean, how many wives did Solomon have? So really, who was the queen, right? Everything gets kind of complicated once you start getting into some of that. And I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of anywhere specific in the Bible that, you deal with it. I mean, you see from other nations, like you have the Queen of Sheba, but overall, you predominantly just have the men who were mentioned. But so often in each of these different nations, there was kind of the king's harem, that he had all of his women, that there wasn't just one in particular. Sometimes they'd have kind of their favorite wife. I think maybe you see that in the book of Esther with Ahasuerus there between Vashti, and then he regrets what happened there and then goes and finds Esther. But yeah, so like I say, I don't have like a great answer on that.
That wasn't a position necessarily that was named or even acknowledged.
Right, right. I think I saw Jared and then Autumn and then Johnny.
There's the one that's mentioned as queen. I'm trying to remember what chapter in the Kings the woman actually ruled.
Oh, yeah, that was earlier in 2 Kings. That was before, I think, Joash. That'd be 2 Kings chapter 9, maybe.
Like once in the position of that leadership, then that name was given, or title at least was recognized. But it seems only
Was it Queen? Well, yeah, you had Jezebel in in 1 Kings, and it comes up again in 2 Kings, but Queen Athaliah, that is chapter 11.
Yeah.
And, I mean, even when you think they're Jezebel and Athaliah, neither one were great examples.
That's the one that was trying to have all her kids killed.
Right. Athaliah basically had everybody killed, and one of the grandkids slipped through her fingers. Yeah.
You may not know the answer to this, but thinking about the meanings of some of these names, was Josiah, were these meanings assigned to the names after the fact, or does that make sense?
No, it does. Autumn was asking about the names and some of the meanings, if it was something that was assigned after the fact, or I guess kind of if it was that at birth. My understanding there is that it would probably be at birth. Now, whether or not they necessarily lived up to the name, I mean,
With his parents named Yas, and they did not.
right. And sometimes it's because what we find happens is that they were treating God like every other god. So in their mind, it was no big deal, because it'd be no different than like at times you see like some of the others who have influence from some of the pagans and things like that come into the name. But yeah, you see like for Josiah, y'all supports, well, obviously Ammon didn't care. Ammon, that was no big deal, but at the same time, Ammon would have wanted the strength of any god to come into play. And you at least see to a certain degree that they, in Judah, that they kind of maintain some of this. And there's some of the things that will come up with the names again once you reach the end of chapter 23. One of Josiah's sons, that he has his name changed by the Egyptian Pharaoh. And even within both of the names, there's a connection still to God. Now there's some more that kind of goes into it there, but nonetheless, oftentimes they would still try and at least include the god. I mentioned in previous classes that a lot of times they believed gods were somewhat bound by geography. And so they would know, well, the god of this land is Yahweh. And so they'd still have some connection there. But they didn't always do as their name says. Yeah. Johnny?
I'm just gonna say, we were talking about Josiah. He was at the right age to have been around his grandfather when he was trying to straighten everything out.
Mm-hmm.
So, he could have had the benefit of that.
Right, that he could have seen a little bit of that and certainly could have been influenced by it some. Again, earlier we mentioned sometimes, and as Adam brought up in the gospel meeting, kids are going to be impacted and influenced more by grandparents than parents at some point, especially in those early years. That can be a big thing, and so certainly he could have seen some of that in his granddaddy and made the change that he needed to. I don't want to, we're not going to have time to really get into the next part, but we can somewhat look ahead. If you go to 2 Chronicles 34, 2 Chronicles 34 gives us a little bit of a timestamp that we do not see in 2 Kings. So we know in 2 Kings that 8 years old is when Josiah becomes king. 2 Chronicles 34, somebody read verse 3.
During the 8 years of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father David. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the wooden images, the carved images, and the molded images.
So there you have a couple of different timestamps. How old is Josiah then whenever he really first starts to show interest in God? In the 8th year of his reign, which means he was how old? 16. 16 years old when Josiah suddenly starts to seek the Lord God. Maybe there was something that he remembered from Manasseh all the years before. Maybe there was something else. Maybe he started to think about his name. And he starts to think about, well, who is this Yah that supports, right? Who is this Yahweh? And so he starts to seek out the God of his father David, and that's when he's 16. Then in the 12th year of his reign, so he would have been what, 20? 20 years old now, he starts to try to get rid of some of the idols that were in the temple and things like that. Then if you go back to 2 Kings 22, when we pick up, Lord willing, next week, we're going to see in verse 3 that it's in the 18th year of his reign that he then starts to commission the temple to be repaired and restored. So when you look at Josiah, it's not that everything happens when Josiah is 8 years old, but there's kind of a progression of things. At 16, he starts to seek who God is and starts to try to follow after him. At 20, he realizes we've got to do something about these idols in the temple, and he starts removing them. And then at 26, he starts to have the temple repaired. And then, of course, it's going to go on from there, and we'll see everything that he does. But Josiah was up against a lot. If you want to read ahead, read chapter 22 and chapter 23 this week, and just think about how far the people of God had come at this point. Especially in chapter 23, when you read about everything that was taking place, not just in the land, but in the temple. Josiah had a lot to fight against. And then we'll think about what it took for him to fight against that. So we'll stop there. Lord willing, next week we'll pick up in chapter 22 and verse 3.